Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Remind everyone here in-house, if you'll be so kind to make that final courtesy check that your cell phones have been turned off. And, of course, we will post the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments to us simply emailing speaker@heritage.org, speaker@heritage.org. Hosting today's program is Marion Smith, visiting fellow in our B. Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. He explores the continuing relevance of America's founding principles and political traditions, as well as the history of early U.S. foreign policy and understanding our nation's international role. He also focuses on constitutionalism, federalism, international law and institutions, as well as European politics. Mr. Smith earned his bachelor's degree in government and history at Wolford College. He studied international relations theory at Oxford University and the European Union law at the University of Amsterdam, and he received a master's degree in international relations at Central European University. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Marion Smith. Marion?
Thank you, John, and thank all of you for coming today to discuss the closing of the American Monument. To start, let's just take a step back and contemplate why we have memorials and national monuments at all. For George Washington, the purpose was the nourishing and the perpetuating of the spirit of freedom and patriotism in our country. For James Madison, these places were precious to the nation as the memorials of its origin and early transactions. For Benjamin Latrobe, President Jefferson's surveyor of the public buildings, these places represented the tranquility, the prosperity, and the happiness of American government. Offering sagely advice very early on, George Washington cautioned us from politicizing these places that represented ideas higher than daily politics. He wrote about the erection of the memorial to the American Revolution in 1795, and I quote, "The event to which it is dedicated, the emblems to which it is composed, and the effect which it is meant to produce have all an intimate relation to the rights and happiness of the people. Let it be commenced then, not through the organ of government as a political act, but in a mode which will best testify the sentiments which spontaneously glow in the breasts of Republican citizens." Well, my, how far we've come, if you've observed what's gone on this month. Now, there have been 17 partial government shutdowns since 1977, and if history's any guide, there will be more in the future. So that's nothing new. What is new are the arbitrary and unnecessary actions of the National Park Service this month, which closed many memorials, national parks, and other public places which remained open in previous government shutdowns. Far from leaving these monuments open, they've taken actions to barricade them, enforce the barricades, and make life as difficult for American citizens as possible, far from the tranquility and prosperity these places are supposed to represent. One Park Service employee was quoted as saying, "We've been told to make life as difficult for people as we can." So we are here today to discuss the purposes of America's monuments, the actions of the National Park Service during this partial government shutdown, and how those actions comport with the law. We're very honored today to have Congressman Rob Bishop, who serves Utah's 1st Congressional District, and he will offer some keynote remarks, and then we will turn to our distinguished panel to speak about not only the history and purposes of America's monuments, but the legal ramifications of some of the Park Service actions. Representative Bishop serves on the House Armed Services Committee and the House Rules Committee, and he has continued to serve as chairman of the Public Lands and Environmental Regulations Subcommittee of the Natural Resources Committee. Please join me in welcoming Representative Rob Bishop.
Thank you. I appreciate your kind introduction and the charity applause. I appreciate that all. I'm happy to be here, even though it's not wise to talk when you're actually upset and mad. But then I've been in that situation for the last 3 weeks. The other day, I was trying to meet with a couple of Air Force generals, and as usual, I was late. And I found out that if you have to go in the Rayburn building, the elevators are always slow and always crowded. So the escalators are far faster if you want to get from the basement up to the first floor. Except this morning when I tried to go there running late, I realized that somebody had messed up and all the escalators were all going down. Every one of them, which I thought was a perfect metaphor not only for our country and for Congress and for this administration. But I'm here to talk about what not only the Park Service is doing, but the Forest Service and Fish and Wildlife have emulated them, as the policies clearly are those that are based on vindictiveness and pettiness and politicizing situations that took place. I think the only question is, how high up does the instructions to take this approach actually go? I feel this is going to be another IRS investigation where every time you turn around and have another investigation, you find out there's another level above it that actually made this issue. You have seen what has happened in the World War II Memorial. Everyone's upset about it, but it's also happening on public lands everywhere throughout this country. So you have read about people that are not allowed to visit graves in Tennessee, or the school bus route in Tennessee that's been closed down, or the inn in Tennessee that they were actually serving lunch as the Park Service employee rangers came in with their lights flashing on their cars and their guns drawn, or the senior citizens and foreigners that were held basically under armed guard in Yellowstone, then forced to take a 2.5-hour bus drive where they weren't allowed to stop for any kind of bathroom break. And when they actually did stop to take some pictures of buffalo, were threatened again, saying that photographing was recreating and they couldn't recreate in Yellowstone under the close down. A jogger in Valley Forge was fined $100 for jogging. A DC playground in an area that has never seen a Park Service employee there, they actually chained and padlocked the playground so kids couldn't go on the swings or the slides. One park in Utah, which I always thought was a city park, the Dunn family for 30 years had been having a picnic there. Unfortunately, this park actually happened to be on Forest Service grounds, so when they went for their 30th anniversary picnic, they were shoved off the grounds before they could ever put their food down to actually eat in the park. All these things clearly show that the purpose of public lands which is supposedly for memorializing what has happened in history and also providing recreation opportunities, is simply being placed in a secondary position to showing that there is power and there is control by certain groups. They claim there are First Amendment exceptions. I guess if you're going to protest the World Bank or immigration issues from the same people that allowed the Occupy movement to stay for several months on federal land without paying any fees for it, but not for cancer research programs or for weddings or for the German-American Friendship Day, which was canceled in the German-American Friendship Garden. And heavens knows what you think would actually happen if somebody wanted to exercise a Second Amendment right on public lands. Now, in all fairness, for those of you who find this appalling, from somebody who lives in the Intermountain West, my question simply has to be, so what? We are living with this every day. This activity is nothing new for us. We have been doing this for months. When you have a person out in an area that decides to stop a legal outfitter from going onto the grounds because she doesn't think there should be a commercial activity in her wilderness area, or in Washington, where they have expanded the area of a park to include something that was basically a city park and then banned an annual church picnic and a fundraiser benefit for veterans because the noise would bother the historic and cultural aspects of the rest of the park. Or in Nevada, where somebody, a victim of a murder's body, was given up by the Park Service in trying to find it. The family tried to find somebody who would go search privately. 15 months later, they were able to raise the money to get the special use permit as well as the insurance the Park Service insisted, and once that private firm was allowed to go into the park, found the body within 2 hours. Another Air Force staff sergeant who drowned at Lake Mead, the Park Service gave up on it. The family had to wait 10 months, get an attorney, go to court to get the permission to have somebody else go in there and find the body, which they did in the space of a couple of days. In one park on our border, in which the Park Service wanted to move their electronic devices from point A to point B, and the electronic device was simply the back of a truck. It took 6 months for the land manager to give permission to back up the truck and move from point A to point B. Helipads, which the Forest Service wanted, the Border Patrol wanted to have in a forest area. Forest Service agreed to 3 pads. Fish and Wildlife disagreed. A year and a half later, those pads were not there to help enforce the border. You have in the Grand Tetons in Washington, where we've long found that paddling does not actually involve or denigrate any of the fishing opportunities, you still have in areas that were designated by Congress as wild and scenic recreation rivers. They have banned any kind of recreation that involves a motor, a paddle, or an oar. What's left? Fish watching? It's the only thing they possibly have. When the Park Service makes a public comment against the Keystone Pipeline, saying that it could involve the viewshed of the park or the implementations of the park's mission, even though the closest park is 30 miles away from the pipeline. When you have the Fish and Wildlife finding that there is an endangered species that happens only to grow on oil shale, only there, and allows the county to have a mitigation plan if they have it by March, which unfortunately this plant only blooms in June and July, and you can't tell what the plant is until it actually blooms, but they have to have in March their mitigation plan for what they don't know exists. Establishing a sage grouse level at a certain altitude, even though there are no birds at that altitude, but they simply said at that altitude they're supposed to have birds, therefore that becomes a sage grouse habitat. Grazing has been stopped, timber mining has been stopped, and I'm sorry, when the World War II monument is opened again, all of you who live in the East can be happy, but I want you to know that these kind of activities have been going on in the West, and they will continue to go on in the West by a Department of Interior which is still vindictive, petty, politicized, and wants to show control rather than power. Look, I'm pleased that Mr. Cole is going to be here. He's going to be talking about the Eisenhower Memorial a little bit later on. I want you to realize that is a memorial that has broken probably every rule, every concept, every traditional activity we have done to try and get it established. It is still over budget and it needs to be changed significantly. And it shows once again the dysfunction that we have in certain areas of our government. Now, when the Berlin Wall came down, all of a sudden, everyone realized the idea of centralized, overly bureaucratic government fails. It doesn't work. We realized that everywhere in the world, it was discredited everywhere in the world, except in Washington, where the idea of centralized bureaucratic government still seems to be the goal. The opposite of that is what our nation was supposedly founded on. In preposition, I apologize. Upon which our nation was supposedly founded, which is the idea of federalism. I know most people, when we talk about federalism, their eyes glaze over. They think of the essay they didn't write in high school and nothing else about it. But federalism still allows people to have choices and options in their lives and to choose those. We have examples of that if we actually try to venerate that. In Wisconsin, where the state is actually running and managing certain lands on federal property, even though the federal government told the governor to shut them down, the Wisconsin governor said, no, they are still operating. In Arizona and Utah and South Dakota and Colorado, the governors in the state stepped up. They actually funded the opening of the national parks over there so they could keep going. We have a situation in the state of Utah, it's called Sand Flats, an area that was owned by the Park Service, not Park Service, but BLM, which they admitted they didn't have the staff or the manpower or the money or desire to actually maintain and regulate. When a near riot broke out, they decided to make a deal with the county so that the county actually now organizes, controls, pays for, and receives royalty from the managing of that recreation area, and it is done brilliantly. We have another one in the southern part of the state of Utah called Coral Pink Sand Dunes, where actually the federal government has finally given over the land as well as control and management of the land to the state of Utah, and it was recently listed as one of the hidden treasures. You see, we can still make this work if we indeed come up with the idea of federalism that allows different options and different choices in different areas and allows the state to take leadership. We can prove that state forests in Idaho produce more revenue and are healthier than the federal forest next door, simply because that process works. You all know Yellowstone was the first national park that was established. The second national park was Mackinac Island in Michigan, which was given back to Michigan because they could better manage it. And as you've seen in the shutdown, they can better manage it. That's not the fact that we have to have the federal government has to control everything. Like when I was in Germany last time, I met somebody working in the German Foreign Service, and she was a preteen when the wall came down. And her first trip into West Berlin from her home in Potsdam, she was just amazed as she went into a store of all the stuff that was there to purchase. She went into one grocery store and realized that there were 5 different kinds of sugar she could buy, 5 different brands. Because in East Germany, you either had sugar or you didn't have sugar, and it was usually the latter. Here she had 5 different choices. And her first thought was, wow, there are 5 choices. And her second thought was, why do I need 5 choices? You know, in the ideal socialized world, if they provide an adequate quantity of cheap sugar, maybe one source is actually enough. But we all know that doesn't work in real life. What it simply means is you need that kind of competition to be able to provide you with what you need. The same thing happens with public lands. You need different choices and different options. There needs to be 5 sugar. I recently read a book about members of my religion who tried to live in communist East Germany. And as I was reading it, I realized one of the concepts is that the public land policy in communist East Germany is the exact same public land policy we have in the United States today. Either we're wrong or they were right, and I really don't think it is the latter situation. Now, it's one of those things that we have to realize there has to be a change, and to actually allow us to partner with states and local governments to open up these areas, to manage these lands, would be the best thing we could do to actually do this in a functioning, rational, particular way. I am pleased that the current Secretary of Interior is not a simple, is not a traditional administrative appointee who's risen through the ranks. She actually comes from the business world of outdoor recreation, and realize that if you're actually going to get something for the public land, it has to be there for people to use and to enjoy. I certainly hope that mindset becomes inculcated within the federal government, because that is the solution to what we need. The purpose of the land is for people to enjoy, and if we're not doing that, we are simply failing. And what I'm trying to tell you is that actually having everything coordinated through one federal agency does not help that situation. If we really were serious about opening up our lands for public enjoyment, we would have a partnership between state and federal government, or just turn over more and more of these areas to state and local governments where people who know what they're doing can actually be in charge, and you wouldn't have the situation we are finding ourselves today. If nothing else, the government shutdown has shown why states are important, why federalism is simply important. I'm sorry, but the bottom line is simply this. Federalism is the solution to our problems, and it is the salvation of this country. And in this area, more than anything else, we need to make sure that we use it, and use it properly. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Congressman, and he's graciously agreed to take a few questions before we turn it over to our panelists. So is there a question or two from the audience? We'll send around the mic. Yes?
Milton Grenfell, I think your idea of change at the top, maybe it will help, is a good one. But what do you do when you have a whole department that's filled with thousands of employees who are all basically statists, or they wouldn't work for the state? How can you turn the elephant around?
That's the effort that we are going through to try and make sure that we give more authority to states, trying to make deals with states. You can, within FLTMA, already have the ability of the federal government to keep controlling the land, but they give the ownership and management back to state and local governments. We can push those entities. And then we can also try and push to simply realize that standardization and a communal approach to everything being owned by the Department of Interior doesn't work. We need to go and do the other way and start turning things around so more and more authority goes to local governments to do these jobs. The House has started to do this. Things like our efforts with the Forest Bill, which is called Secure Rural Schools Bill, is an effort to try and turn over the authority of making sure that what happens on the land is controlled from the local level. We have those efforts. They have to be done, but they have to come from Congress.
My name's Howard Sagermark. Congressman, you have a good bill out on the Eisenhower Memorial. What's the future of that bill?
I don't know, nor does anyone know the future of the Eisenhower Memorial. With the CRs failing, the authorization for the site selection as well as the continuation has expired. it may come back in a CR with some limitations. The House has cut the funding for the continuation of that commission. The commission, though, has not expired, nor have any of their employees been furloughed in this situation, and they're still sitting on $20 million that has previously been appropriated they could be spending, even though they don't have any ongoing revenue coming into them through the appropriations process. What I think the House has clearly said in the committee work that we have done so far is we have to rethink this. We should have a memorial to Eisenhower, but it should be done the right way. I think Mr. Cole will be talking about that. There are ways of doing it the right way that can be a whole lot cheaper than what we're attempting to do, and do it in a way that is consistent with other memorials that we have done in the past. This one has broken all the rules, tried to take shortcuts, and it has proven to be an unacceptable solution at this point.
Please join me in thanking Representative Bishop.
Thank you very much.
And I would just like to express my appreciation for Congressman Bishop's leadership on the Eisenhower Memorial, which was an undemocratic and untransparent selection process, and until he took it on, it perhaps would have gone to completion without being addressed. So thank you. We're now going to move to a panel discussion here, and we're very happy to have Bruce Cole, who's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He's also the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities and is the author of 14 books and numerous articles. In 2008, President George W. Bush awarded Mr. Cole the Presidential Citizens Medal for his work to strengthen our national memory and ensure that our country's heritage is passed on to future generations. Just this summer, Mr. Cole was appointed by President Obama to be a member of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Memorial Commission, and we're very appreciative that he is now in that post. We're also very pleased to have Andrew Closter, who is a legal fellow here at the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation, and he's a graduate of New York University School of Law. Here at Heritage, he focuses on civil rights, the role of the federal courts, and other constitutional issues. We're just going to remain seated and have a conversation here. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have a conversation with you, the audience. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Marion, and thank you, Representative Bishop, for being here, and thank you for your leadership on this important issue. I think one of the things that the shutdown has shown is the importance of memorials and how Americans care about them. They are sacred to us. And I'll just start off with this image of Dwight Eisenhower in Normandy in 1963. And this is Normandy today. That these cemeteries are shut down, that the flag does not fly above them, is really a desecration of our memory and of those brave souls who perished in Normandy. We have a tradition of presidential memorials. There are not many of them. Most presidents don't stick around Washington. They go home and they die, and they have usually simple memorials. But we do have a tradition starting with the great obelisk of the Washington Memorial and moving on to the Lincoln Memorial and then to the Jefferson Memorial. And these memorials, which are the Jefferson and Lincoln, our 20th century, are superb memorials because what they do is they elevate and show the importance of those presidents who they memorialize. So if you look at the Jefferson Memorial, which harkens back to the classical past, it embodies in it like all the early federal architecture, the traditions of Greek democracy and Rome. It anchors us to the past. But if you walk up those steps, just like if you walk up the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, you are elevated. You get the sense of the gravity and importance of that person who is being memorialized. There are a couple of others. This is the James Buchanan Memorial. No one knows about that. It's well hidden. And then there's the Franklin Memorial. Actually, Franklin Roosevelt wanted this. He was talking to his cabinet. He said, if you want to memorialize me, make a plain monument the size of my desk in the Oval Office. And they did it. But then you have memorial creep. And this is the one room of the new Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial, which shows various episodes from his 4 terms. Here are a group of people. They actually look like they're waiting for a men's room. And then you have the Kennedy Center, which is itself a memorial, a kind of living memorial. And now I want to talk about the Ike Memorial. Now, I'm all in favor of the Ike Memorial. Ike was a great American. He embodies a great American story. He comes from humble origins. Here's his house in Abilene. Of course, he was Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces on D-Day and the campaign that defeated Germany. He was a great president, I believe, served 2 terms, had a good record on civil rights, interstate highway, was a very smart and savvy politician, but he was humble. And here in his tomb in Abilene, there are a couple of inscriptions, and here is one about humility. Humility must always be the portion of any man who receives acclaim during the blood of his followers and sacrifices of his friends. And Eisenhower was a humble, modest person, plain-spoken, and I think he would be horrified by how he is about to be memorialized. And as you can see, on October 25th, 1999, the Public Law 106 was passed, and it says that an appropriate permanent monument to Dwight D. Eisenhower should be created. So far, the Eisenhower Memorial has been given $62 million in taxpayers' money. They have about $20 million left, as well as $2 million a year since 1999 for staff and salaries. Now, the architect of the Eisenhower Memorial is Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry is very famous. He's one of the star architects. He has this interesting philosophy. He said, I will, and at the end of the sentence, this paragraph says, I will reiterate what I've said many times. I cannot face my children and tell them I have no more ideas and I have to copy something. Well, this is Frank Gehry's philosophy. He's famous because he upsets all the architectural canons. He doesn't believe in the past. His work is not rooted in anything. And I'll just give you a few examples. Here are his dancing houses in Prague, a complete perversion of stability and order. Here is his Weatherall Lewis Center in Case Western Reserve. Here's 8 Spruce Street, and you can see how his style is. And here was the one thing he tried to get done in Washington, which was in addition to the Phillips, and it actually looks like the Gehry that, Corcoran, that ate the Phillips. Like a giant 747 or a fleet of them crashed into the Phillips. And you can see even how out of sync it is with the surrounding architecture. This was actually approved by Fine Arts Committee and Capital Planning Committee. And here is design for the Eisenhower Memorial. It is radically different than anything done before. It's a postmodern architecture. It's not indebted to the past. And what it does is it really minimalizes Ike. These columns that you see here are 8 stories high. And in them, between them runs a scrim with dead trees on it. And there are 2 other scrims. This, I think, violates the Macmillan Plan. It is completely out of sync with any other memorial and anything around it and anything in Washington. And it's indicative of the way that Gehry builds. And what it does is it minimalizes Ike. And right in the center of this memorial, right in back of the middle tree, you see Ike as a cadet. The original plan was to show Ike as a barefoot boy from Kansas, and here he's a cadet. So none of the accomplishments really are embodied in this statue. He is dwarfed by the giant scrims and the columns. And so that sense of elevation and importance and of dignity and Ike's sense of humility that should be embodied in this memorial isn't. And it's really a kind of perversion, turning upside down of what Eisenhower stands for. And since Gehry says, I'll tell you what I think, I tell people this is what I do, this is what we do. I'm talking your language, making it something better. I'm taking your junk and making something with it. There I would think he's talking about the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Obelisk and the Jefferson. Can't we do better? yes. As I said, I'm all in favor of the memorial. I'm a commissioner. I think it should be built, but it should be built in an appropriate form. Right now, the site is 4 acres. It's festooned with these giant 8-story columns. It doesn't reflect the dignity, the humility, and the accomplishments of Dwight David Eisenhower. Here is a very simple memorial. I'm not suggesting that something like this be built on the grounds of the Eisenhower Library in Abilene, but certainly we can do something that's better. We can build something that's more appropriate, and that will be a credit not only to the commissioners, but to the rising generations of Americans who will learn something about the intrinsic good and deeds of Dwight Eisenhower. Thank you.
All right. Well, if it's built, I don't guess we'll have to worry about anyone trying to break in to that memorial during a shutdown. It'll keep people out when it's open. And Andrew, we're going to let you take over from here and explicitly talk about how the Park Service actions on public land and at memorials perhaps violate a few laws and constitutional rights.
Sure. Thank you very much. There's been a lot of great information here from both the congressman and Mr. Cole, and I hope that folks become more interested in our national monuments. I just spent the weekend in Philadelphia. I used to work there at a First Amendment group, civil rights group, overlooking Independence Hall, and I walked around and I got to see folks with their families visiting Independence Hall and trying to see the Liberty Bell and things like that. And I didn't say anything, but I wanted to hear what folks were saying. And the refrain was pretty unanimous, even without I didn't prompt or anything. I was just listening. Folks were constantly harping on how unnecessary it was to shut down these monuments and how it seemed disproportionate to what was going on in Washington. And so I just want to talk a few minutes and raise some of the legal issues and point out how folks that are concerned about these issues and have instincts as to what's going on, usually your instincts are pretty right. So one of the things that a lot of folks are saying is, isn't it odd that the Park Service seems to be spending more money trying to shut down these parks than they would be spending just letting the parks lie, quote unquote, fallow. Well, that's actually a legal argument that you're making when you say that, and because you have instincts that in the absence of a congressional appropriations, the president can't spend money, and there's a law there. It's called the Anti-Deficiency Act, and it says that unless Congress passes a money bill, it's actually a felony for a federal officer to try to do stuff. That's the technical term. To try to do stuff or spend money. So there's a prohibition on that sort of a thing. And so the argument that folks are making when they say it's weird that we're spending more money keeping these things closed is they're saying, isn't that somehow violating the Anti-Deficiency Act? This is actually an issue that is sort of well within the president's discretion. The law is 31 U.S.C. 1342, and it says that without Congress passing a bill, there are only a few sorts of things that can continue operating. And the phrase is emergency authorizations involving the safety of human life or the protection of property. And this is where we get the OPM rule that says that essential personnel get to keep working. And each of the 3 branches of government gets to sort of define for itself what is necessary to protect the safety of human life and federal property. So it seems that what the Park Service is saying here is that the only way for us to secure this property is by putting up these massive barricades. And that seems to be odd to folks. I don't think it would be challenged in court. I think that it's sort of a safe bet for the Park Service to say these words, but it doesn't pass the smell test to most Americans who are with their families trying to visit. And in fact, there's another argument against this, which is that for many years, the executive branch, since the Stockman Memo in 1981, OMB issued a regulation that said, what sorts of things are essential? Well, we get to keep security on the payroll. So actually, the park security is still getting paid. So it seems odd that the Park Service would be shutting down a park for security reasons when their entire security personnel is allowed to still be staffing these monuments. So that's just kind of strange. The second issue I'd like to talk about is the blocking of private or co-owned property. The congressman mentioned Lake Mead, and there was a news story out very recently about a whole bunch of folks with vacation homes in Lake Mead being told to take a hike, to get out. They have year leases, and somewhere in their lease there might be something about having to have a second home, since these are vacation homes. And so folks are asking, why are private places being shut down? When I was in Philadelphia, I understand that the Independence Tavern was shut down as well. That was opened in 1773. It was frequented by some of the founders. It's a private establishment on federal land that serves, food and alcohol, and it's very well regulated. And it was shut down too. And so the question is why? I also heard that the Park Service tried to shut down the Mount Vernon park, and Mount Vernon is privately owned, actually, and it's privately run. But the Park Service got a little overzealous and tried to barricade the parking lot of the privately owned Mount Vernon historical site. So this seems a little bit odd to folks, and I would just point out that this is one of those areas where what matters very strongly are the lease agreements and the property rights of the owners. Many people own property on federal land. Many people have different kind of businesses they run on federal land. And I would encourage those landowners not to necessarily take the Park Service or any federal agency at their word when they come to you and tell you to shut down. Take a look at your lease and see if you have rights. And if you do, you should recognize that and you should stick up for yourself. One of the other things that I just heard about was that the federal government has started to reopen certain places. So the Independence Tavern was allowed to reopen, provided that Pennsylvania would foot the bill. The Statue of Liberty was allowed to reopen, provided that New York State would foot the bill. This actually does seem to me to be a little bit of a problem, because 13 U.S.C. 1341, again, the Anti-Deficiency Act, says that absent a congressional appropriation, because Congress has the power of the purse. Unless Congress says it's okay to spend money on something, it's not okay to spend money on that. And so I don't know what the legal justification is for the Department of the Interior to permit states to foot the bill when there's a law that says that the federal government cannot let anyone foot the bill if there's not an appropriation involved. So I would be very curious if members of Congress would take a look at that. The third issue I'd like to talk about is the First Amendment. And this is a huge issue. And this is something that, again, a lot of folks are talking about. The World War II vets, they fought for our country, and they have a very strong instinctual response to things being shut down. I saw some sort of sign that someone had that said, "Normandy was closed too." So the First Amendment says that folks have free speech, and they have free speech, and the government has to have a good reason for shutting down public land or regulating public land before they can curtail the freedom of speech. There are actually court cases, federal court cases from the D.C. Circuit, pointing out that, for example, the National Mall is a traditional public forum. What that means is that folks, when the government seeks to regulate these traditional public forums, the regulations need to be content neutral. They need to be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest, and they need to leave open alternative channels of communication. So that's the test. And now we ask, is the National Mall a traditional public forum? And are these signs or these barricades, where do these fall? On what side of the line do these fall? What can an average citizen do on the National Mall? Well, there are also court cases that say that thinking or reading or passing out literature, those are all First Amendment protected activities. So it would be very strange for a Park Service person, if I'm walking through one of these barricaded areas where the sign says, closed except for First Amendment activities, it would be very strange if a Park Service person actually tried to kick me out, or anyone out. Because if you simply say, well, I'm thinking about politics, that's a protected activity. If you say, I'm going to go read a book, that's a protected activity. So it seems like any citizen can walk into these areas, and there's essentially nothing that the Park Service can do to you. And in fact, from what I understand, I had another lawyer in our department at the Meese Legal Center here go down and try to find out what authority the parks thought they had to kick people out. And they're saying, well, we're not actually asking people what they're doing. We're really, we're enforcing it to the best of our abilities. So if you're a private citizen, remember that you do have rights here. There's a second problem with what the federal government's doing here, and that's they do have these signs that say closed except for First Amendment activities. Well, what I just explained was that almost anything can constitute a First Amendment activity. So it really just says you're not allowed in here unless you're allowed in here. So anybody's pretty much allowed in here. So what is the point of the sign? I would say that the point of the sign is largely just to scare people away. And on that ground, federal courts have struck down things like this before, and folks can sue. The ACLU could sue if they were interested over these policies. And I would encourage that, folks to do that if they think that's the right thing to do. The First Amendment is designed to protect, the average Joe, these families that are going and trying to learn about our history, to visit memorials. It's not designed simply for lawyers. And so there's an added problem with all of these policies, and that is that they are hopelessly vague. There's a great line from Justice Potter Stewart in a case where he points out that a man of average intelligence shouldn't need to guess at what ordinances and things mean, and I think that's exactly what's happening here. So I would just like to close then with a couple takeaways. First of all, park rangers. What should you do if you're asked to shut down speech or kick people out? I would just say that if there's an ambiguity in what you're being told, to err on the side of permissiveness, to err on the side of the First Amendment, and to take a look at the folks and simply say, I'm here to protect property. I'm not here to enforce political points. So over on this side of the spectrum, if you're a park ranger, there are things you're asked to do on a daily basis, such as be a little aggressive with enforcing X, Y, or Z. You sort of have to follow your boss when he says that. And over on this end of the spectrum, you're being asked to kick out all people of one race, for example, and you clearly don't have to follow that. And I would say the First Amendment kind of falls somewhere in the middle. So use your judgment if you're an officer or a park ranger of some sort. Use your judgment and err on the side of the First Amendment. And I would also encourage, my second takeaway is for citizens who are trying to visit these memorials. Know your rights. Heritage, we have our Heritage Guide to the Constitution. I encourage folks to take a look at that. It's online. There are sections on the First Amendment written by eminent legal scholars, law professors, and the like. Take a look at that and learn your rights. I'm not encouraging folks to go to these areas and pick up the barricades and drop them off in front of the White House. That may have additional property or vandalism concerns, but certainly if you're simply, paying no attention to these signs that may not be legally there, that you seem to be well within your rights there. So it seems to be, despite what the Park Service might be saying, it should be business as usual for folks and their families who want to visit, to see our nation's capital, to visit Philadelphia and see where Independence Hall or where the Constitution was debated, or to visit places like Lake Mead, or to enjoy our national parks. The problem is that this is not an academic issue. There are fines being given out. There are people that are being arrested. And I would just hope, a lot of these cases seem to be slam dunk. So I would just hope that people would challenge these. And if there is, it's very difficult to be on the receiving end here. So if there's a very authoritative looking state trooper or park ranger telling you to get off the property, I understand if you don't necessarily stand up for yourself. But I would hope that there are a few enterprising ACLU types or et cetera that would stand up to this kind of encroachment.
Thank you, Andrew. So there will be a hearing this week, and I believe it's tomorrow, in the House on the investigating the actions of the National Park Service. And essentially what we've been talking about is a thing called Washington Monument Syndrome. And this was begun in 1969. This is the term given to the political tactic of making, as you put it, average Joe feel the effect of a partial government shutdown. And in essence, it is making life difficult for average U.S. citizens for a political impasse here in Washington. The first parks director to engage in this activity and to sort of pioneer the idea of Washington Monument Syndrome was George Hartzog, and he was soon after that dismissed. And I think that I'm correct in saying, and I've investigated this, that during this partial government shutdown, there have been more monuments and memorials closed than in any other shutdown in our history. And the stories that you see coming out, and even on social media, people posting video clips and all of this, kind of reveals an intimidating activity by Park Service personnel. Certainly not all are engaging in this, and I quoted earlier a Park Service employee who described it as quote-unquote disgusting, that they were asked to make average American citizens feel so displaced and inconvenienced through no fault of their own. So one of the major questions that I'm interested in here, and I want to know the opinion of each of you, is this the sort of high watermark of this sort of activity? I mean, it's obviously violating the spirit of why we have memorials and public places like this, because of the very ideals they are supposed to represent. We've obviously seen an overstep by this administration and the Park Service in particular this month. Is this going to get worse with every shutdown, or can we hope that this will be the extent to which American citizens will be treated in this manner?
With respect to Lake Mead, again, I have heard some property owners, there was a piece, I think, in the Washington Times interviewing them, and some property owners pointed out that they have had leases on this federal land for 30 years, and that includes during the last shutdown in 1995, and they were not asked by the Clinton administration to vacate, and now they're being asked to vacate. So there's something new. I also don't recall reading about any cases where ordinary folks got so angry that they started violating some of these orders. People are American citizens, they know their rights, but they also know that they're not going to fight every fight. And so they are largely compliant even when sometimes the policies are a little bad. But I can't think of any case, in my mind, where there was a policy that large numbers of World War II vets or folks just started storming the barricades, so to speak. And that seems new as well.
Yeah, I think this sort of backfired because the flashpoint was the World War II memorial. I don't think anybody expected this. I don't remember all 17 shutdowns. But this, I think, was something new, where the vets, and especially those who were coming on the honor flight, arrived to see the thing barricaded, and they were outraged. Because after all, this is their memorial, just as it's our memorial, and it was padlocked. And I think the reaction really set off a kind of chain reaction, where then attention was paid not only to memorials here and the subverting of their purpose all over the country. I don't think that was expected.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, social media, for example, highlighted the story of this man who saw the grass overgrown at the Lincoln Memorial and got his push lawnmower, and went to mow the grass since it wasn't being done. And that, to my mind, is a great act of volunteer public mindedness by a private citizen. And of course, he was asked to leave. Another example is you saw the 200-year-old Senate clock stop ticking, not because there wasn't a living, breathing human standing next to it who could have wound it, but because the official winder had been furloughed. And this does represent, I think, something fundamentally very troubling, and it reveals a new sort of attitude, especially by the Park Service towards the American people, and it's sort of striking out against them, and not as a people who have a government who are caretakers of their public lands, but somehow to punish Americans for daring to cut funding. So it is, I think, quite problematic, and I certainly hope that we'll never see this again in a future shutdown. So now we're going to take your questions. Again, we have mics. If you'll just raise your hand and please identify yourself.
Hyde. Question for Bruce Cole. Can you give us an idea of the lay of the land of the committee that you were on? Who are the dramatis personae, and what are the likely outcomes, and what are the shoals on the different shorelines, and so on?
I'm just starting to navigate those treacherous waters right now. Well, the commission is composed of, it's a bipartisan commission composed of 4 representatives, 4 senators, and 4 citizen members. And I'm really just starting. I've only been on the commission for a couple of months or so, and I've been making visits to the other commissioners and sort of taking their temperature about how they feel about the memorial and getting advice and talking to all sorts of people. So it's a little too early for me to predict what's going to happen.
Ben Stovall, I'm an intern here at Heritage, actually. What I wanted to ask you was in relation to something that you actually said just before the questions, Mr. Cole, and that is that when the World War II veterans showed up, a lot of their outrage came because this is their memorial. It's something that belongs to them, and that's how it's been seen. In a lot of ways, I think that people are waking up and being outraged at this entire shutdown because they're seeing their memorials go, and that's every memorial, not just the World War II one. It's been something that's from the nation to the government. My question to you is, how do you think we can get people to start to understand that this is far more than just the memorials, that it reaches into every area of what's going on right now, and that's becoming more and more the government decreeing what goes to the people instead of the other way around nowadays?
Yeah. Well, let me just, a little follow-up on that first question is, I mean, I think that the commissioners want to get this done. I think everybody realizes that needs to be done. I think the question is how it's to be done. As you know, it's not only the World War II memorial. I had an email from a friend of mine whose daughter was visiting Normandy, and with a bunch of vets who were there at the same time. They were locked out. They climbed over the stone fences and got in until they were shooed off by authorities. I don't know. I am really surprised because what you see is that these monuments, World War II memorial especially, are symbols. And people start asking the question, well, those are the vets' memorials. Those are my memorials. Why am I not able to visit something that I actually own? And, you know, what authority does the Park Service have to keep me out of it? I mean, this is, I think, goes to your point. And I think this is a very healthy exercise when people begin to feel, well, what is their relation to the government? There was a wonderful piece by Mark Stein when he talked about the Forest Act, which followed the Magna Carta. And he said, you know, it's true that, the English peasants who were benefiting from the Forest Act had more access to the commons than do Americans who are living in 2013. And I think that's true. So I think this is a really healthy discussion, but I hope there are ramifications of it.
George Peeler. I'm an attorney in Falls Church. This is for Andrew or anyone else who wants to comment. My understanding of the Anti-Deficiency Act is it's basically enforced by the executive against inferior agents of the executive. So could someone comment on the legal actions or rights of action that might pertain aside from congressional oversight?
Right. Well, I would first of all say that Congress, there's the Office for Compliance, there's there are inspectors general in a variety of different places. Congress has the ability, and they have Congressman Isa's committee, the Oversight Committee. There are a variety of different places where members of Congress can go to request reports or to do their own investigation as to expenditure. And those sorts of things can get publicity, and there can be political ramifications. So number one is obviously then the political processes. In terms of private rights of action to enforce the Anti-Deficiency Act, I don't think there is one. But there are a whole host of different statutes that the executive is subject to, but the executive is the branch that does the enforcement. So if There's a non-enforcement issue. I know that there have been other non-enforcement issues at DOJ that folks have raised questions about. Congress, again, has the power of the purse to say we're not going to make appropriations to DOJ until they get their house in order and start applying the law where it ought to be applied.
Presumably, though, people arrested or fined, as you mentioned.
That's true, too.
Invoke it in their
If,
contest.
yeah, if the executive ever, for example, the gentleman that was mowing the lawn in front of the Lincoln Memorial, presumably there's some groundskeeper whose job that was until he or she was furloughed. And if he or she had given some indication that he or she was accepting those services, that groundskeeper would be subject to the felony provisions of the ADA and would be able to challenge that prosecution or conviction in court. But I don't see, we're asking, would the Obama administration enforce the ADA in other contexts? I don't necessarily see that. And there's no real way for an average citizen to sue the federal government for doing stuff without authorization. Maybe, I mean, that is possibly, there are structural constitutional provisions, and in the first Bond case, the Supreme Court said that the federalism provisions of the Constitution do include private rights of action, so someone could test that case, but until then, I would doubt that.
Yeah, around the same time that I heard World War II vets, and there was also one at the Vietnam Memorial, had to take barricades away. I heard that the park police somewhere in DC, I'm not sure where it happened, were providing the type of security that I guess they do. It was some rally for citizenship for illegal aliens, and it's really been kind of hush-hush in the press, and I just wasn't sure if you've heard anything more about that.
I haven't heard anything more about that. What you might be saying is, gosh, it looks like favoritism. It looks like certain content is allowed to be expressed, but certain other content is prohibited.
On the National Mall.
On the National Mall, right. Now, I would and that would be a lawsuit if that were the case. However, the Park Service has said that they're going to allow all First Amendment activity. So, again, presumably, if someone wanted to have an anti-immigration rally, they could apply. However, another problem with these policies is, again, another lawyer in our department went down to ask, how can I get a permit? And the answer was, we don't know how you can get a permit. So hiding a permit process is a problem in and of itself. And that's a policy that could be challenged in court, too.
Herman Belts is my name. Have there been any Tea Party politicians and Tea Party leaders trying to inaugurate legal challenges to these things? Isolated individuals are going to have a hard time doing it. But the Tea Party leaders, what about the VFW, the military? They have lawyers, they have resources. Are they doing a legal strategy on this, or is it a matter of thinking, well, it's not going to last that long, and so we might as well just wait it out?
Very briefly, one of the things that the Mies Legal Center does here is we do coordinate activities like this. We haven't on this, but it'd be something worth looking into. I can mention that the Washington Post is reporting, I think today, that a federal judge has ordered the National Park Service to reopen Langley Fork Park in McLean, Virginia, based on a private lawsuit by the McLean Youth Lacrosse Organization. So that was a preliminary injunction, I gather. This youth organization sued, and the federal judge said that the Park Service has to keep that federal land open. That's the type of thing that could keep happening, and I'll have to get back to you.
Hi, my name is Bill Ludy. I'm a retired career naval officer. I served for 26 and a half years, mostly on aircraft carriers. Can you hear me back there? Okay. My father is a 92-year-old World War II vet living in New Hampshire, and he fought in every major campaign in the Pacific on board the USS Yorktown, commonly referred to as the Fighting Lady. He obviously is heartsick over the shutdown of the memorials on the mall. and he has called it, in our local newspapers up there, a shameless act of commission. The day after the shutdown, I went down to the mall and was stunned to see the barricades put up like strategic hamlets around each of the 4 war memorials. So I got a little closer and noticed that the barricades had actually been wired together at the top and the bottom. And I noticed 5 Metro police officers, some on motorcycles, some in squad cars around the World War II memorial. I saw 5 park rangers and 4 park maintenance officers. And the maintenance officers were wiring they had these big bundles of wire that they were wiring the barricade shut. And I guess that gives credence to the proverbial old joke about how many, Park Service maintenance guys does it take to wire a barricade shut? Well, I know the answer, it's 5, with needle nose pliers. Now, I sort of lay the background of my question here because my father's conclusion on seeing all of this on social media, and I have photos of it as well. And by the way, there was one park ranger standing on the inside of the barrier giving a tour to a group of people standing on the outside of the barrier, pointing out the different parts of the memorial. So my father could only come to the conclusion that someone in the administration, we don't know who, is vindictive, petty, and small. So Andrew, my question to you is, if you go down there and take a look at this, you can only come to that conclusion. So based on your legal analysis, but also a policy analysis, I served in the Pentagon as a political appointee in the Bush administration and also in the White House. And I know that money is reprogrammed all the time. People are deemed essential all the time. Not to mention that these are open-air memorials that don't require much security or much maintenance. And by the way, each sidewalk entrance to the mall had a barrier that said it's closed, and people were just walking around those and strolling throughout the mall, ostensibly breaking the law, with no repercussions whatsoever until you got to the strategic hamlets. So why is it that the president, who has the authority with the stroke of a pen, could open these malls and remove the barricades? What, in your view, aside either legally or from a political perspective, why? It just defies common sense, and it appears to these 92-year-old folks to be vindictive, petty, and small.
Yeah, why does the sun rise? Why does the sun set? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, and it's definitely enraging. I can't even, folks understand this.
It's touched a nerve.
Your dad understands this. People understand this. I'll leave it to you folks to say more, but I cannot. Their justification, I know what their legal justification is. Their justification is, gosh darn it, we need to padlock these things to secure the property. From who?
But the lawyers in the Pentagon last week deemed 400,000
Yeah.
people essential and told them to come back to work.
Yeah.
What on earth is causing this inability to break the wires on those barricades and move them aside when the lawyers just at the stroke of a pen say 400,000 folks can come back to work?
Certainly, I'd say that this administration has taken a very broad reading of what it can and can't do, and this is a very weird case for them to finally say, gosh, we just don't have the authority we have to shut it down. So I don't know if anyone else wants to comment.
Well, just that I know what you're talking about. I've seen that, and to see that sort of behavior against citizens who are just touring open-air memorials is mean-spirited. And that sort of mean-spirited behavior by a government towards its people is absolutely unacceptable. And when you realize that it was a decision that was made, no law tells them they have to close those memorials. In previous shutdowns, they were not closed. And if you then, on top of that, moreover, look at the purpose of these memorials and contrast that with this behavior, it is deeply, deeply troubling. So I leave it to Andrew and others to find legal remedies to some of this. But as a people, we really ought to make it clear that this is absolutely unacceptable. And in any future partial government shutdown, a Park Service or whoever else is responsible for caretaking these places cannot behave in this manner. I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Well, it seems like there's a common thread to both the Eisenhower Memorial in particular and the shutdown of the monuments in general. And that's that there's an elite that doesn't seem to care about the rest of us. There's a political elite that doesn't think monuments mean anything to people. Obviously, they wouldn't have done this, or they don't care that we're upset about it, which shows an extraordinary detachment from the people that elected them. And then there's an aesthetic elite, an artistic elite, that keeps trying to push monuments on us, that most people don't understand and don't like. And they're so tone deaf as to the 99% of the rest of us that it really is an extraordinary state of affairs. And I was curious if you share that perception and what to make of it.
Bruce, I'll let you.
I think one of the things that hasn't been taken into account on the folks trying to build the Eisenhower Memorial is the tremendous groundswell of outrage. It's all over. It's in conservative and liberal papers. It's in big town publications, small towns. It's just huge. And I think what has happened in the Eisenhower Memorial is that there's a determination to move ahead with the Gary plan pretty much unaltered. And I feel as a commissioner that the situation will be much improved by listening a little bit more and listening to this criticism and showing a sense of accommodation. After all, it doesn't look like there's going to be any private money raised for this. As I understand, so far, not much has been raised, and I don't think there's any requirement in the legislation that talks about raising private money. So this is, not the commissioner's memorial. This is not the staff's memorial. This is the people's memorial. And I think it's important that as wide a range of opinion is listened to and accommodated. And I think everybody will be better off, and I think we'll have a much better memorial.
And just on top of that, showing some respect and deference to the subject of the memorial.
Yes.
It's not as if we don't know what Dwight D. Eisenhower thought about architecture and his preferred styles. He favored classicism. He said as much in the opening of a library in Kansas while he was still living. I think one last question here.
My name's Howard Segermark. On the way over here, I happened to walk through the park honoring General Nathaniel Greene, and there is a public notice board. On that, it announced that this facility is closed due to the government shutdown, National Park Service. Not only did I commit civil disobedience by walking here through the park, but there were approximately 30 toddlers with their mothers openly recreating on this closed facility. It strikes me that we have to laugh this stupid policy off the boards, and let's try to do so.
Right. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank Bruce and Andrew for being here. Appreciate it. We stand adjourned.